drew my attention. Drew my attention, but I had no idea who it was. And each time I'd go to class, I'd look at the photograph, thinking that they resembled individuals that I knew, but I had no clue that I was actually staring at my own great great grandfather and mother. So when I got out of school for summer vacation, it was Wessington Plantation's 160th anniversary. So our local newspaper, the Robertson County Times, did an article about the plantation. They had a photograph of the White Washington family, and also this same photograph that was in the social studies textbook. And my maternal grandmother happened to be visiting us from Chicago, and she spent the weekend with one of her older brothers, and she told my mother to have me to bring the camera out when we came to pick her up. So when I got to my great uncle's house, they had the newspaper spread out on the kitchen table, and my grandmother showed me the article. And I said, "Grandmother, who is that? That picture's in our seventh grade social studies book." So she pointed to the gentleman seated, and she said, "That's my grandfather, Emmanuel Washington, and he was the cook at Washington. The plantation's called Wessington, but everyone refers to it as Washington." And that was next to him was her grandmother, who was the head laundress on the plantation, and her name was Henny. My grandmother was excited to see it because she was the baby of the family, and they passed away before she was born. But my great uncle was 10 or 15 years older than my grandmother, so he knew them personally. So he told me to call out to the plantation. He said the White Washingtons still live in the big house. He said the slave cabins are still there. There's a slave cemetery. Everything is pretty much how it was back then. So the very next morning, I called out to Wessington and I spoke to Ann Consalvin Talbot, and she was a sixth generation descendant of Joseph Washington, who founded the plantation in 1796. I told her that I was interested in my family's history and I had seen the newspaper article, and she said, "Well, everyone knows who your great great grandfather was. We still have his portrait in the living room." And so this is a portrait of my great great grandfather, Emmanuel Washington, and he was born at Wessington, April 23rd, 1824. The Washingtons commissioned the famous artist Maria Howard Wheaton to paint his portrait. Is now worth about $25,000, and it's still held by some of the direct descendants of the Washingtons. She also brought out about 10 to 12 legal sized documents which recorded the births of the slaves on the plantation. And on the left, I was able to find my great great grandfather, Manuel, born April 23rd, 1824, and my great great grandmother, Henny, born April 26th, 1839. And I was also able to find early ancestors. Well, Miss Talbot invited me out to Wessington, and I had to have my mother drive me out. And so when I got to the entrance gate, I had a flashback from when I was 5 or 6 years old. My maternal grandfather used to take me for a ride in the country nearly every Sunday. And so often we would pass by Wessington, and my grandfather would stop or slow down at the entrance gate and point and say, "That's Washington. That's where your grandmother's family came from." Of course, at that age, I knew my grandmother was a Washington, but that's as far as it went. So it dawned on me what my grandfather was really saying when my mother took me there years later. And this is the Wessington Mansion, and it was started in 1815 and completed in 1819. It was built by the slaves on the plantation. And my first trip to Wessington was like going back in time. There were original furnishings, there were portraits of some of the other slaves. There was also furnishings that had been passed down to the Washingtons, to some of the slaves, and they passed these down to their descendants. And this is the Washington family crest. The Washington's earliest ancestor was William D. Hurtburn, and he was given an estate called Wessington for military services. So the family became known as D. Wessington, and when they came to America, they changed it to Washington.
John, I have a quick question.
Okay.
How far off are the believed connections between these Washingtons and the rather famous one named George?
Okay, they thought that Joseph Washington, who founded Wessington, and President George Washington were second cousins once removed. However, we did DNA testing with a descendant of George Washington's nephew and one of the Wessington Washington's descendants, and it showed that they did have a connection, but it was going back like 800 years. So what had happened was President Washington's grandfather was John Washington. Joseph Washington from Wessington, great-grandfather was John Washington, and for years they thought that they were the same individual, but President Washington's John came to America a year earlier than the Wessington Washingtons.
Okay, thank you. I was wondering about that.
And these are some of the slave cabins at Wessington. And in 1860, there were 40 log cabins, which housed 274 enslaved individuals. At that time, that was the largest number of enslaved individuals in the state. And these are some of the photographs that I took of some of the slave cabins that were still there when I started my research. And this was in the 70s with a one-step camera, if any of you can remember those. And this is a former slave cabin, and I worked with a team of archaeologists in the 1990s to do archaeological investigations where the slave cabin area used to be. And the site that we're actually digging in is where my great-great-grandparents' house stood once. Miss Talbot also took me to the slave cemetery at Wessington, and it's estimated to be about 200 individuals buried there based on a ground penetrating radar. Ms. Talbot also told me that the Washington family deposited all the records from the plantation in the Tennessee State Library and Archives in the 1960s. This is now on 69 rolls of microfilm, over 11,000 items, and I've gone through all of this numerous times. And when I first started my research, I was going through the actual original documents because they hadn't been microfilmed at that point. So there are many letters in the plantation, many letters in the collection. So George A. Washington was the second owner of Wessington. So at an early age, his father turned over the management of the plantation over to him. So he would travel to New Orleans to sell tobacco crops. He would go to Virginia and Maryland to purchase slaves, and he would go to New York to invest in the stock market. So while he was away, his wife, mother, and children and the overseer would write letters on what's going on the plantation, what their neighbors are doing, which slave ran away, who died, who had a baby, especially during the Civil War. So much so that you feel that you know these individuals personally. There are a number of photographs of some of the former slaves. And the document on the upper right is a document where my great-great-grandfather agreed to work for the Washington family for $125 a year as the cook. And below that, there's a cornbread recipe of his. This is gentleman on the left is Joseph Washington, and he came to Robertson County, Tennessee in 1796. At that time, the lady who he later married was a baby. He went to the home of his cousin, Colonel Archer Cheatham, and was asked by him being a bachelor when he was going to get married. And he said, well, I'll just marry this girl when she grows up, which is what he did in 1812 when she was 16 and he was 42. Okay, this is the route that Washington and the slaves would have taken from Southampton County, Virginia to Wessington. And this would have taken about 3.5 months walking. And some of the slaves passed on to their descendants that they walked every step of the way. Just
interrupt for a moment, John. That is, I did a presentation a couple weeks ago about migration to Tennessee in the late 1700s. And that is the Cumberland Gap route, which people took. It looks like a crazy roundabout way, but it is the way that people walked because there are no major rivers and it takes you through the gap. But that's the route everybody took before before the Nickajack expedition and before people started taking a road across the Cumberland Plateau, which wasn't until about the 1780s. So.
This is George A. Washington, who was the son of the founder of Wessington, Joseph and Mary Cheatham Washington. And this is his wife, second wife, Jane Smith, who was born in Florence, Alabama. And this is a photograph of the Wessington Mansion that I took a couple of years ago. And the Wessington Mansion is on the National Register of Historic Places. And this is a map of the plantation that I redrew from a photograph in an old book from the 1920s. And this shows the mansion and all of the outbuildings. The Tennessee State Museum did an exhibit based on my book called Slaves and Slaveholders of Wessington Plantation. And for that exhibit, they created a model of the plantation so it shows the big house and the various outbuildings surrounding the plantation. And Wessington was entirely self-sufficient. This is another shot of it. And this model is now in the museum here in Springfield. And we have a Wessington exhibit there, and we're planning on expanding it to show where the slaves went after emancipation for the next couple of generations and their descendants. And this is a blacksmith shop from an early 1900 photograph at Wessington. This is some of the other outbuildings in the early 1900s. Slave population and source of slaves at Wessington. Mr. Washington was in Virginia in 1795, and at that point he owned 5 slaves. By 1813, he was in Robertson County. He had 33. By 1820, he had 44, making him the second largest slaveholder in Robertson County, second only to his father-in-law, Colonel Archer Cheatham. By 1830, he owned 80. By 1840, 109. 1850, 143. 1860, 274, making them the largest slaveholders in the state at that point. From 1801 to 28, he received 16 slaves through inheritance from his father, one of his brothers that never married, and other relatives. From what I was able to document, from 1801 to 1843, there was 125 slaves purchased and around 195 of them born on the plantation from 1795 to 1860.
John, can I interrupt for a question?
Sure. Yes.
I think that I know what your answer to this is going to be, but early on, most of the acquisitions were made by him traveling to Maryland/Virginia and bringing them back, weren't they?
Well, Joseph Washington, most of the earliest ones were bought in Virginia, and then later on, George got some of them in Maryland.
Okay, but they didn't buy them in Nashville. They literally, and I've come to understand why that is. But
right, because no one that was in this area at that time, you couldn't hardly buy slaves from them.
Yeah. Okay.
For their own, they had them for their own purposes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And this is another birth register, the beginning of the birth registers from 1795 to 1860. And I was able to find some of my earlier ancestors on this document as well. On the right is a slave bill of sale for my great-great-great-grandmother. She was the mother of Emmanuel, who was the cook. Originally, the family, when they first came from Africa, was owned by Colonel Michael Blow. He was a Revolutionary War colonel. He had a large plantation, about 50 slaves. He passed away in 1797 and willed 15 of his slaves to his son, Micajah Blow. And so my family went with him. In a couple of years, Micajah Blow became heavily indebted, and he sold my great-great-great-grandmother Jenny and her sister Sarah to Joseph Washington in 1802. And he brought them from Sussex County, Virginia to Tennessee. And there's been 14 generations of our family that have lived here since. And also in the collection, there's about 40 slave bills of sale dating from 1801 to 43. And my family is the earliest of those slaves that can be documented from the beginning to present day descendants. And this is a document I created, or a register I created, from all the slave bills of sale. And the first one of an entire family was for my great-great-great-great-grandfather and mother, Tom and Jenny, and their 4 children. Henny, the 11-month-old, is the mother of my great-great-grandmother, who was on the photograph that led me to the research. So he purchased the whole family for $1,590 from James Thompson. And then next, Washington purchased 14 slaves from the Union Bank. A slaveholder had purchased these slaves, couldn't pay for them. Basically, they were repossessed by the bank. So Washington went to Nashville and purchased all of the slaves and then brought them to Wessington. And this next one shows.
Can I interrupt? May I interrupt again? Can we go back to that previous slide? I'm just fascinated by this stuff. The next one, sir. Okay, Louisa, who is 1 year old, was sold for $100. John, that caught my eye because my experience has been that the very, very small children take a lot, are sold for a lot more than you would have thought. But this is your document, and so you have proof of this. And but like
and it depends on the time, the time or the era as far as the prices. This is in 1842,
and this was Union. So this is at some type of a bankruptcy, probably, right, or a lawsuit. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And then in this instance, George A. Washington's first wife was Margaret Adelaide Lewis, and her father owned a plantation in Nashville called Fairfield. Major Lewis was a close friend of Andrew Jackson. So as a wedding gift, he gave George A. Washington and his daughter, Margaret Adelaide Lewis, 29 slaves for $1. So basically a wedding gift. So these 29 slaves, was about 7 families, and some of those are interrelated. And I know a lot of their descendants that's still here in Robertson County and in Nashville. Slaves sold from Wessington Plantation. There was one, the earliest record is a slave named Henry Williamson, and he was purchased at Wessington when I think he was 17 years old. And so he was very rebellious. Anytime somebody said something that didn't suit him, he would run away and stay out for weeks till he decided to come back. He actually broke into his previous owner's house and stole part of the money, or took part of the money that his owner got for selling him to the Washingtons. So the Washingtons sold him in New Orleans in 1842 for $800. David White, or Davy, was born in Todd County, Kentucky. The Washingtons purchased him and 4 of his brothers and brought them to the plantation. He actually ran away 4 times before he was captured in the state of Indiana. He was then taken to New Orleans and sold for $850. After emancipation, he came back to Wessington, where there were still 3 of his brothers. They became sharecroppers for a number of years. They then moved to Cheatham County and sharecropped, and they moved from there to Nashville, and some of their direct descendants still remain there. Names used by Wessington slaves. I was able to tell the African origins of some of the slaves at Wessington by their names and what tribes they descended from. Many of them had biblical names, some classical names like Caesar and Pompey. Most slaves named their children after someone in their families, especially men, because men had a tendency to be sold away from the family more often. So for continuity of the family, they named them after male relatives. There were a number of slaves that had place names like America, Axum, which is in Africa. There's Carolina Tom, because there was already 2 Toms on the plantation to distinguish him. There were several slaves that had presidential names like Harrison, Jackson, Jefferson, Monroe, and Washington. And then some of the slaves named their children after some of the white Washington family that had close relationships with them. And the last slave that had a true African name was born on the plantation in 1858, and that person's name was Ole Inca, and that goes back to the Yoruba tribe in Nigeria. And this is a map from a DNA project that I started. So I had DNA tested from, I've had about 35 DNA tests since in total in all, to tell where the various families originated from. Labor division on the plantation. The men on the plantation primarily worked under a task system, which means the plantation owner would assign a task. Of course, they knew how much work an average man could do in a day, so they set a task to take up your entire day. However, some of the faster workers could accomplish this early, so then they worked on their own tobacco crops. And so Washington would keep up with how much tobacco they raised, and then when it was sold in New Orleans, then he would give them part of the money. Then mainly they worked in tobacco production, but they also produced other crops. There were blacksmiths, carpenters, stonemasons. There was a large whiskey operation on the plantation where all the surplus corn that didn't go into feeding the animals and the families went into converting it to whiskey. There was also a large pork operation. You could find Washington hams on the menus as far south as New Orleans and as far north as Philadelphia. They were, famous for the hams. There also coopers on the plantation, or barrel makers. The women primarily worked in the gardens, did sewing and weaving, domestic work, processing pork, milking cows, caring for children. There was actually a nursery on the plantation where any woman that had a child that was over 2 years old, they were cared for by some of the elderly women. The women also cared for the sick and the elderly and did cooking for their own families. And the photograph in the upper left is a family of black and white sharecroppers at Wessington, and this was taken around 1907. On the upper right is a woman preparing to do the wash there at Wessington. And then on the bottom photograph on the left there's a hog killing at Wessington, and then on the right is a group of former slave women processing the pork. And then the building that you see in the background is a smokehouse, and that building is still standing at Wessington.
John, can I interrupt?
Sure.
You said that that picture on the bottom left is a hog killing?
Mm-hmm.
Good Lord, that's 20 hogs. Wow.
And it's estimated it went at Wessington's peak, it would take in about 42,000 pounds of pork to feed the entire population of slaves on the plantation in the Washington family.
Wow, thank you.
Uh-huh. And then this is a tobacco field at Wessington. And in the 1860s, the slaves there produced 250,000 pounds of dark fire tobacco, making them the largest producers in the United States, second largest in the world. And based on yields at that time, this would have taken about 350 acres. And this is another shot of the smokehouse there at Wessington. Each week, the women would line up at the smokehouse and they'd be given so many pounds of bacon, meal, flour, sugar, and vegetables and so forth, depending on the number of individuals in their families. And this is a list of runaway slaves from 1838 to 1854. The first that I could document was a slave named Jack. He ran away in September of 1838. He was captured in October in Cadiz, Kentucky. A $30 reward was paid for his return. Another slave, Lewis, ran away at age 22, and he made it into free territory before being captured. $40 was offered for his return. And Davy is the gentleman I told you that ran away 3 times before being captured, and the Washingtons sold him in the New Orleans slave market. Rebellion and punishment on the plantation. Acts of rebellion included running away, aiding others in running away, leaving without permission, fighting overseers, refusing to work, breaking tools, riding draft animals, work slowdowns, fighting each other, pretending to be sick, congregating for church services. And this was stopped totally after Nat Turner's rebellion, because Joseph Washington was from Southampton County, Virginia, the same town that Nat Turner was from. So after that rebellion, they cut out all worship on the plantation, fearing that the slaves would be congregating, pretending to be worshiping, and could be plotting to kill them. How the rebellion was dealt with was whipping, confinement, not allowing other visitors on the plantation, or them going to other plantations and ultimately sale.
John, okay, you said that they clamped down on church services after the Nat Turner Rebellion. Did they eventually allow them again a couple years later, or did that remain?
No.
So it was illegal to have church services at Wessington in the 1850s?
It wasn't illegal, just a number of the people that were killed in Virginia were neighbors of Joseph Washington's parents. So these are people he personally knew. So fear of that, they totally stopped it. Now, after emancipation, they donated funds to help them start the Antioch Baptist Church, which out in the open, they did not worship, but they did it in secret, because I've interviewed scores of descendants, and they're all saying the same thing about that. Interviews. I was very fortunate when I first started my research that I had about 25 individuals that were around that ranged in age from 80 to 107 years old. The lady on the upper left is my maternal grandmother, and she was 85 when she passed away. And so far in the direct Washington line, no one in my family has died under 80. And next is my grandmother's brother, Bob Washington, and his wife, Maggie Washington. And my great aunt, Maggie, lived to be 99 and a half before she passed away. And she was the last individual that was still around, that was around from the beginning of my research. Next was Maddie Terry. She and I went to church together, and she actually knew my great-great-grandmother, and she started working at Wessington when she was a young girl. Next to her was Carrie Washington, my cousin, and she died when she was 99 years old, and she also worked most of her life at Wessington. Next was Sam Gardner, and he died when he was 98, and he also attended church with me. The gentleman on the center bottom was Joseph Washington. He's my cousin, and I met him, and this picture was taken on his 102nd birthday, and he died a couple of weeks before he turned 107. And he actually lived next door to my great-great grandparents, so he had a lot of information to share. Mrs. Ann Nixon Cooper died 19 days before she turned 108 years old, and she was raised by a lady that had been enslaved at Wessington. So I got a lot of information from her, also a number of photographs.
So John, did you say that you are immortal until you turn at least 80 years old? Is that what you kind of figure by?
I'm hoping so. I hope I don't break our record.
Well, so if you and I are in combat, I want you beside me. So anyway.
Now, my dad's mother's sister died when she was 107. And let's see who else. My great grandfather on that side died at 101. And one of my great grandmothers died at 104. So hopefully I'll be around a while. This is Maddie Terry, and she told me when she was growing up that her great grandmother had been a slave at Wessington, and she lived to be 104 years old. And she would gather up her great grandchildren and her grandchildren to tell stories about her life on the plantation. And where the Wessington Mansion stands, it's on a hill, and then back behind the hill, there are slave cabins on a hill, and then where the land flattens out, there's a stream. And she said her great grandmother told her that when she was a child, she and the other children collected clay, brought it up on the hill where the Wessington Mansion now stands, and the adults molded and made bricks. And she said evidently they knew what they were doing because the house is still standing. And Maddie said that her great grandmother could still chop her own firewood at 104 years old. She could thread a needle without using glasses. And this is my cousin Joseph. And he told me that my great-great-grandfather had a beautiful singing voice, and he led most of the songs in their prayer services. So he even sang some of the songs to me that my great-great-grandfather used to lead. This is Mrs. Ann Nixon Cooper. And President Obama mentioned in his acceptance speech, mentioned Mrs. Cooper voting for him when she was over 100 years old. And she said, you know, John, they're making such a big deal about that. She said, it's been people as far away as Japan that have come to interview me. And she said, they act like I didn't have an interesting life. So she married a very prominent dentist in Atlanta. So she said, I've had a very interesting life. So she wrote a book about her own life called A Century and Some Change, My Life Before the President Called My Name. It's very interesting. At the outbreak of the Civil War, some of the slave men especially started emancipating themselves by running away. So on this document on the left, Mr. Washington decided, well, they're running away. So he had a meeting with them and offered to pay them $10 a month if they'd stay on the plantation and work for him. So 18 of them agreed. And so a short while after that, they got together and said, well, he's just trying to keep us on the plantation. So they all ran away. And these are the dates that they ran away from the plantation.
John, what year and month did that happen?
1862.
Fall,
when the first guy,
correct?
Yeah.
Probably. Okay.
Yeah.
The proclamation was made in September, and then it supposedly went into effect in January. So
yeah. And this is a list of men from the plantation that enlisted in the Union Army, and I have all their pension applications, and it's a great source of genealogical information. You have to say how old you are, how do you know how old you are, who all previous owners were, if you had how many wives, you had to list those, how many children, all that type of stuff. So this one guy, Frank Washington, said he knows that he was 12 years old when the war broke out, because he said that the Washingtons didn't start the kids on the plantation, or the men, male children, to working until they were 12 years old, and he had been doing this about 3 years. So he said, however, he was as large as most full-grown men, and so when Union soldiers came through the area taking men from the plantations, they grabbed him up too. And he said he recalls his mother running out screaming that he's only 12, but they took him anyway.
What did the 40th Regiment do, John?
Okay, they were located, they started here in Springfield, but I'm not sure of, all the duties they had during the war.
Okay.
And this is a group of African-American troops in Nashville, I think in 1864. This is Fort Negley, and some of the former slaves from Wessington helped erect it. After emancipation, well, during the Civil War, the population at Wessington got down to only 3 people. By so many of the men running away, they didn't have adequate firewood and food to last for the women and children on the plantation. So Mr. Washington got permission to send the women and children inside Union lines, so they were in contraband camps for 2 years during the war. So after emancipation, some of them stayed in Nashville, created neighborhoods there. Some of them moved up north, some out west, all over the place. So my great-great-grandfather and mother and their family came back to Wessington, and this is a photograph of them in the late 1890s. And some people ask, well, why did they come, back to the same plantation they had been enslaved? Some individuals sharecropped from some of the local farmers, and a lot of people lost everything they had in the war. So some of them worked for them, and they weren't able to pay them. So they knew at least Washington was able to pay them because due to his investment strategies, he was even wealthier after the war, even with all the slaves gone, than he was beforehand. This next list is like a Civil War timeline that I created. It tells what's going on the plantation when the slaves ran away and different events there.
Hey, John, I have a question from one of the viewers here.
Okay.
Did they enlist in the Union Army, or were they recruited? Conscripted into the Union Army.
Conscripted. Yeah. Some of both.
They were conscripted to dig trenches,
right.
Okay.
Work on the railroads.
All right.
Okay, this is the Antioch Baptist Church, which was founded in 1869 by former Washington slaves and others in the community. It was also used as a school. And I found that some of the former slaves as old as 40 and 50 years old were going to school to learn how to read and write, because they realized the importance of education. And one of the original Fish Jubilee singers actually taught school at Antioch. And the parents, which was a great sacrifice, had to pay $1 per month per child for their children's education. And this is the comparison of the property value of Wessington from 1860 to 70. It shows the farm value $250,000 in a 10-year period. It decreased to $110,000. Personal property, which included the slaves, was $279,000. By the 10-year period, is $400,000 worth. The land was 13,100 acres. He sold some of the land to local farmers and some of the former slaves, so the acreage is down to 10,000. Tobacco produced was 250,000. It's down to 45,000. And there was a drastic increase in the entire county of about 13% due to the slaves leaving. Pork on the plantation, or pigs, there was 1,200 of them in 1860. It was down to 50 in 1870. Cattle, 310 in 60, 35 in 70. So you can see what a drastic change there is at Wessington.
So I'm looking at these numbers, John. Basically, the production of the farm, of the plantation, went to ruin.
Yeah.
Basically what you're saying here. Yeah. I'm a little, the only one that confuses me is, how did the personal property go up? Because
due to Washington's investments in stocks and bonds.
Oh, so he took, okay, so he invested.
So he was investing, so his investment paid off.
Okay.
Okay, this is an agreement of my great-great-grandfather and the Washingtons. So he was to be off every other Sunday. The Washingtons provided food and housing. He was responsible for any lost time. He provided his own clothing, responsible for his own doctor's bill. And Washington stated that he had nothing to do with Emmanuel's family. That was his own responsibility. Then this is a contract of John Lewis, who was one of those 29 slaves that was given as a wedding gift. So this specifies the terms of individuals that were sharecroppers. So Washington provided the land, tools, draft animals like horses, mules, oxen, fertilizer. He provided food and housing. Washington received 2/3 of the crop, and the sharecropper received 1/3 unless they provided their own draft animals. Lewis and his family is to provide labor. They're to take care of the animals. They could not work for anyone else without Washington's permission. They were charged for all lost time. Lewis was responsible for the care of his mother and responsible for his and his own family's medical bills.
One thing I don't understand is the one that says he cannot work for others without permission from Washington. I guess.
Okay, they don't want you, if you're supposed to be working on their farm, going to work on someone else's.
Okay.
And this is a baptism of some of the former Antioch Baptist Church members in the 1880s. And this lady is the daughter of a Wessington slave. She's my great-great-grandfather's granddaughter. And this was taken in the early 1800s. I mean, early 1900s, I'm sorry. This is Rachel and Wiley Terry, Rachel Washington Terry. Both of them were born slaves at Wessington, and I got this painting from their daughter, who passed away a week before she turned 102 years old. Wiley and two of his sons purchased 429 acres of land that had formerly been part of Wessington, and some of that land is still owned by their direct descendants. And this is their son, Wiley, and his wife and family in front of their 1918 Model T Ford. And they're the first African-Americans that I could document that owned a car. They also donated some of their land to start an African-American school.
John, what was the name of that school? Do you know?
Sandy Springs.
Thank you.
School. And my grandmother attended there. Okay, this is Alonzo Wright, and he was the first African-American millionaire in Cleveland, Ohio. And he was actually the grandson of Ford Washington, who had been born a slave at Wessington. And at one time, he was one of the largest employers of African-Americans in the country. After emancipation, and a number of the slaves didn't come back. So the Washingtons hired other African-Americans and whites to work on the plantation. So I got this picture from a painting from my cousin, Carrie Washington, who passed away when she was 99. And many of the family members said that their grandmother, Fanny, was 100%, well, full-blooded, as they say, Native American. I had DNA testing done on one of her great-great-grandsons through her maternal line, and it showed that she had African ancestry. And then another one of her great-granddaughters, I had her to do an autosomal DNA test, and it showed that she had 18% Native American or East Asian ancestry, which would have been about equivalent if she would have been half. They say she was extremely mean. She told fortunes with decks of cards, and she poisoned one of her daughters-in-law to death that she didn't like. And the house that they lived on at Wessington is still standing. And this is a photograph of some white sharecroppers at Wessington in the late 1800s. So if you've ever done—
John, I interrupt. I don't know how much you know about this, but by the late so at some point they start bringing in white sharecroppers.
Yeah.
And that would have happened probably as soon as the war was over, or?
Yeah, as soon as the war was over.
Okay. Thank you.
And then this is a family that was there at Wessington. This lady wasn't born a slave at Wessington, but some of her family intermarried with Wessington families. So this woman's name was Erie Fort Pitt, and she was married to Alfred Pitt, and he was the largest African-American landowner in Robertson County by 1900. So she sued him for divorce. And so she stated that he was very cruel to her. He hadn't bought her a decent dress in 6 or 7 years, and it was the cheapest that he could find. Her position was that she had helped him acquire everything that he had. She had 11 children by him. So there was a court case for this. So he said that everything that he acquired was by his own doing, and so he didn't have to give her anything. He furthermore pointed out that you and I married back when we were slaves, and we haven't married since we've been free. So technically, you're not my wife, and I don't have to give you anything. So she went back to her former owner, who was an attorney, and he found a law that stated that if you had been enslaved as husband and wife, and you remain living as husband and wife after emancipation, it legally made you husband and wife. So the courts made him give her $1,000, 100 acres of land, and a horse and buggy, and so many pigs and chickens. And so he actually caught a cold from going back and forth to court and died shortly thereafter. And so one of their descendants that I grew up with said, well, John, if our ancestors had all that, why don't we have anything? And so half of in this court case, half the children sided with their mother, half sided with the father. The ones that sided with the mother, the father disinherited. So she lived with one of her sons, and then she gave him all her property when she passed away. So in Tennessee, it legalized any slave marriages without you having to marry again. However, some did choose to marry again anyway, because the Freedmen's Bureau married a number of the former slaves. I have a pension application for my great-great-grandfather's sister, and she stated that a member of the Freedmen's Bureau married her and her husband and several other people at Wessington at the same time. This is George A. Washington, and Jane, I've shown that one before. This is a map of Wessington, how it looked in 1892 when George A. Washington passed. He wanted his son, who was a congressman, to have what was called the Wessington home place. And he also had the other children to draw lots out of a hat to determine what part of the plantation that they would receive as their inheritance. And this is a picture of the Washington family taken the same day as the photograph that I saw in my 7th grade social studies textbook.
Hey, John.
Yes.
One of the questions, and this goes back about 8 slides, but you mentioned that a woman, one of your relatives, hopefully a faraway relative, poisoned her daughter-in-law. Mm-hmm. How did you know that? Was she arrested?
No. Okay. One of her great-granddaughters died a couple of years ago. She was 95, and the woman she poisoned was her grandmother. So everybody in the family that's been told that's what she did.
Okay, thank you.
She was never arrested though, so I guess she was slick enough. Who knows? Okay, this is the Wessington Mansion, and Mr. Washington put a stipulation in his will that some of his kids wouldn't get their full inheritance till they were 30. So his son George A. Washington II built a home on the lower left called Washington Hall. It was three stories, white brick with 44 rooms. And there was a ballroom on the upper floor that could accommodate 250 guests. And many of you no doubt have seen Gone with the Wind and the staircase Scarlett O'Hara falls down. It was fashioned after the staircase in Washington Hall. And some of the crowned heads of Europe, such as the Prince of Greece, had been entertained there. The house over on the right is Glen Raven, and this was built by Mr. Washington's daughter, Jane Washington Ewing. She and her brother stayed in a fierce competition with one another, trying to outdo each other, and they ended up going broke in the process. This is a monument in the Wessington Slave Cemetery, and direct descendants of the plantation owners donated funds to have this monument erected. And we had a dedication ceremony at Wessington in October of 2015. And this has the names of everyone that I was ever able to document that ever lived on the plantation from 1796 to 1865. And burials continued there until 1928. So there are 445 individuals on this monument who had been enslaved at Wessington. And on the monument, I put a cross beside the names of the ones that I know to be buried there through documentation or interviewing some of my relatives. My great aunt that was 99 remembered as a child going to some of the burials with her mother. And another cousin that passed away a few years ago at 95, she remembered the last person buried there in 1928. He was the only person buried there that didn't have Wessington connections, but he was a sharecropper and he died and he didn't have much family, so they buried him there. But everyone else has Wessington ties. So this is probably the largest slave cemetery in the state, or that I know of.
And so, John, to ask an obvious question, that is not an active cemetery. No one has been buried there for almost 100 years, and no one will ever be buried there again. It's private property, correct?
Right.
Okay.
And then on the back, it has a spiritual walk with me, Lord, walk with me while I'm on this tedious journey. I want Jesus to walk with me. And then it's a dedication verse, and it lists the donors on there as well. And then another donor, Stanley Rose, donated to have the cemetery fenced. And this is the dedication ceremony. And so we had, I guess, about 250 people there from various enslaved families, and we had about 50 of the white Washington descendants that came there as well. And our family has held a Washington family reunion probably 70 years or so. At this time, my great aunt was 97. And so present, we had 6 generations, her children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, and great-great-great grandchildren. And this is taken at the same spot that my great-great-grandparents took the photograph in 1891.
John, I know that almost all these folks have died now, but who's the matriarch of the family now?
Let's see, my great aunt died at 99 and a half, and her daughter just died. She was sort of the matriarch after. She died in January of last year when she was 90. She died a week before she turned 96. So her next sister behind her, sort of the matriarch, and I think she's 89 or 90. So there are only, let's say, I guess the only person that my great aunt that was 99 and her daughter, the only ones that have died since then. Since 2000. So we stick around a long time.
Yeah.
Okay, and this is the Wessington Mansion. This is the African-American cemetery. And on the lower left is a restored slave cabin on the property. And then the picture on the lower right is the White Washington Family Cemetery. And I think there's 4 generations of Washingtons buried there. And it was used up to the 1960s.
Okay, John, you said that building on the bottom left is a restored slave quarters.
Right.
I was wondering that's not bad for a slave quarters. I guess it looks better than it did. But is that the only slave quarters left on the property?
Yeah, there was about 10 of them when I started doing the research, and they dismantled some of them. So there was a guy working on the farm, and he took some of the logs and rebuilt the core of it. It's just like it. And of course, on the back, he added that. And there was an upstairs back during slavery time, but he sort of raised it a little higher than they were at that time. And the logs, when we did an archaeological dig in that section, it dated back to around 1830. And this was a book signing I had in Nashville when my book first came out. And there are various African-American families there represented. And then there are a number of the White Washington family descendants. And the White Washingtons have been very supportive in my research since the very beginning, since I was a teenager. And there are many family reunions. On the upper left is the Gardner family. Their ancestors came from there. The picture on the upper right is the Green family, and some of them intermarried with some of the Odies that's in Nashville. And then on the bottom is a family reunion I started in the late 1990s, the Cobbs family, and that's my mom's dad's side, and the Washingtons, my mom's side.
John, you also have these every year or every 3 or 4 years?
Every couple of years, yeah. And the Gardners have held a family reunion every year since 1935, except the first COVID year. When the exhibit was at the Tennessee State Museum, a number of the White Washingtons came to tour it. So I gave them a tour of Wessington, and I suggested that they take a photograph in the same spot that their ancestor did in 1891. So they said, because I know different families of them, but they didn't know each other. And I've been telling them for years that they need to have a family reunion. So when they assembled to take the picture, they said, well, John, you really need to be in the picture with us, because if it wasn't for you, we wouldn't even know each other. And so this shows some of the photographs and faces of Wessington, I call it. And so it's the history in the book, and everything I've done is not just about my family, but about everyone that was ever there on the plantation. The woman in the center, her name was Jane Washington, and she knew how to cure various illnesses with herbs. So if the slaves were sick and they didn't want to go to the white Dr. Dunn, they went to her. And then on the picture with the man in the buggy, that's Granville Washington. He was said to be the son of George A. Washington, who was a plantation owner. And then below on the left is his son and daughter in the middle, and another one of his sons in front of the coach. And his son that's in front of the coach moved to Dixon County to an all-black town called Hortense in the early 1900s. And he purchased a 200-acre farm there. And some of the descendants still owned it until maybe 10, 15 years ago. And these are some of the other photographs of some of the slaves there. So I have over 100 pictures of slaves from Wessington and their direct descendants. So that's how I documented my ancestry. So there's me, my mother, my grandmother, my great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather. My great-great-grandfather's mother was born in Sussex County, Virginia in 1792. Her mother's name was Jenny, and her mother, going back one more generation, his name was Jenny, who was born in Africa. And I'm compiling a book with all the genealogical information that I have on all the people. So I'm going to have this goes from like 1 to 445. And so it names everyone that was ever enslaved on Wessington, if they used a different surname, when they were born, where they were born, when they died, when they were purchased, if they weren't born on Wessington, who the previous owner was, where they went after emancipation, all types of genealogical information, which it will probably be self-published. And the title of my book is The Washingtons of Wessington Plantation, the subtitle, Stories of My Family's Journey to Freedom. If you want to read more, I also have a website, wessington.com. We're also preserving the slave cemetery at Wessington, and I have another website, wessingtonplantation.org. And there's also a documentary on YouTube called Wessington Plantation, A Family's Road to Freedom. And it's been viewed over 1 million times throughout the country. And these are some of the things that have happened since the publication of the book. It was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize Award in Letters by Simon & Schuster, nominated for the National Book Award in Nonfiction by Simon & Schuster, nominated for the Oprah Winfrey Book Club selection for historical genre in 2010. I received a letter from Queen Elizabeth and former President Bill Clinton about the book. The Slaves and Slaveholders exhibit at the Tennessee State Museum drew a crowd of nearly 70,000 visitors. Our local officials had a John Baker and Wessington Remembrance Week in 2014 in February, and the documentary was nominated for several awards. This is the letter that I got from Queen Elizabeth. She was impressed that I spent so many years doing the research. And this is one from President Bill Clinton. He sent this to my editor. She knew him personally, so she sent him a book. And I also traced Lionel Richie's roots for an episode of Who Do You Think You Are? And I got to meet him. His great-grandfather was actually a slave where the the seminary is on Whites Creek Pike. And that's when we had the Remembrance Week with our mayor. So that concludes my presentation. At this point, if there are any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. I hope you've enjoyed it.
I've got a couple. The one obvious one is the house. It's not a plantation anymore. It's just a big house. And the people who own that house, they're obviously friendly. But what is the situation with the house now? Is it owned by people who bought it to fix it up? What's the situation now?
No, Mr. Roberts, who owned the house, passed away in November. So it's part of his estate now. So I don't know. I'm sure it's going to be sold.
Really?
And so, yeah. So hopefully some preservation-minded person will end up getting it.
How much land is it besides the big mansion?
2,735 acres.
You said 2,700 acres.
Yeah.
So is it in an area where people might want to develop those 2,700 acres, or is it still pretty far out?
It's 10 miles outside Springfield.
Okay.
But it's on Highway 49 is not too far from it. So you'd have access to go to I-24 to go into Nashville. So it's not Williamson County real estate where it's going to go and turn into houses overnight, but I hope not.
Yeah. When I did my book, I found that there was a pretty important slave rebellion in near Clarksville in 1856. It was pretty nasty. Did anything happen to Wessington at that time?
No. George A. Washington was in Springfield, and he wrote a letter about it, and he said they had 8 people jailed here in Springfield for suspicion of involvement, but I don't know of anything beyond that.
And there is a chance that you're going to do a couple of versions of your book for young readers.
Yes, my editor, my former editor from Simon and Schuster, left Simon and Schuster and broke off to do editing and publishing on our own. So we're working together, and we're planning on doing books for kids age 12 through 18, and we'll do books on various characters in the book. And so the first one we're working on is the runaway Davy, who made it into Indiana to free territory before being captured. And he tried to kill a sheriff rather than be brought back to the plantation, but he was subdued and brought back, and then ended up being sold. Now, there was one slave, and I didn't find out about this until after the book was published. George A. Washington's wife, Jane Washington, her father owned a big plantation in Florence, Alabama, and her father died when she was, I think, 5 years old. But anyway, she had a number of slaves, and some of her relatives managed it. There was actually a slave named Elijah, and he ended up running away and making it to Canada to freedom. And so he wrote a letter to her aunt, and because he didn't know who she may have married or her location. So he instructed the aunt if she would have Jane to have someone to come and meet a representative of his in Detroit with as much that she thought he cost that was within reason, that he would pay it. And evidently he must have had relatives that he wanted to try to free in the United States, or it wouldn't, even make sense otherwise. But he did make it to a free settlement for blacks in Buxton, Canada.
There's a couple of things that are just bizarre freaks of nature. One is that this big mansion and so much a large chunk of it would remain as one piece of undeveloped land all this time, because there were a whole bunch of mansions and plantations all over the South. But the most bizarre thing is that all the papers would have been preserved. If that hadn't happened, you have no book, you have no research, right? And yet,
well, I would have had to go on the memories of people who knew some of the slaves personally, like some of the information that I did, but some of it I wouldn't have had hard backup for. So yeah, that was one of the good things. A lot of times grandparents or whoever would tell you stories and you can't back it up, but I would say 95% of what I was told, I could back it up by either the slave descendants or the white descendants.
There's a guy that owns a big warehouse in Nashville called Cummins Station beside the train tracks. Yeah. And he hired me to write a book about Cummins Station. And I spent about 3 days working on it. I came back and says, there's no book here because there's not that, there's just not a whole lot out there. Yeah. And we did a pamphlet and because that's all we had. And it was an interesting pamphlet, but it was just a pamphlet, but it didn't involve,
well, in my case, there was so much information that I had to weed out things because the Washingtons kept records on everything, everyday diaries. I mean, even down to what shoe sizes they wore. And my editor introduced me to at a program I had in Atlanta. And she said, this is the first time in my life that I felt like I had bitten off more than I could chew. She said, this man has enough for 10 books.
One of the questions has to do with whether the state or the federal government would purchase the property as a historic site. And I think I know the answer to that question. I'll let you.
I'm guessing it would probably be over $20 million with all that land with today's prices. So,
I mean, I know that on another end of the state, there's talk of Fort Pillow becoming a national park. And even that will probably take 20 years. And that's very worthless land on top of a mountaintop overlooking the Mississippi River. And that won't cost very much, but worthless from dollar point of view. One person was asking where the white sharecroppers came from, where they recruited somehow.
Okay, they were just farmers that lived in the area. Some of them probably had been working on a similar system before then, or just poor farmers.
Well, I'm going to first of all, I'm going to hit pause